In the next two lessons, we're going to look at sustaining biodiversity. We're going to look at it both from a big picture perspective and then also from an individual species type perspective. So in this first lesson, we're going to look at from an ecosystem level, so looking at preserving our whole ecosystems as a way of protecting our species. The case study that you're going to read about is about the wolf. The wolf is really pretty interesting as far as looking at an endangered species and how that can be an indicator for protecting an ecosystem. The wolves, we did a really good job of eradicating the wolves. This part where it talks about 1850 to 1900, that's a time when in our history when people were scared of wolves, and as they were moving west, they were even more scared because now they were by themselves pretty much out in the wilderness with these wolves. And they were concerned about the wolves coming in and taking their kids, attacking them, that sort of thing. And so the government actually had a government-sponsored program to eradicate the wolf, where they paid people bounties on the pelts. And they did such a good job that they killed off most of the species of wolves that were in the United States. Well, on the downside of that, what they figured out was that the wolves were actually really integral to the whole ecosystem. The wolves hunted the elk and the deer, and when they were around, the elk and the deer were too scared to stay out in the open all the time, particularly near waterways. And so they would come, they would get their drink, and they would leave. But when the wolf was gone, now the deer and elk would stay near the waterways a lot longer, and they would eat the stuff that was along the banks. And when they did that, that caused bank erosion. But they also ate all the little saplings of all the little trees that were along there. And those were the trees that the beavers used to build their beaver dams. And so now the beavers no longer had trees in order to cut down and to make their beaver dams, which then meant that there wasn't the pool of water that was behind the beaver dam that other animals used for water or used for habitat. And so what they started to see was this trickle-down effect of where the ecosystems were starting to collapse a little bit because the wolves were pulled out. And so once again, that's why we call this a keystone species. But it was something that we learned by actual practice as opposed to by theory. When we look at the impact that people have on biodiversity, we can have that direct effect like we did on the Yellowstone ecosystem, where we actually removed a species out of the system and caused that destruction of the natural ecosystem. We can also have indirect effects through things like climate change. So as the climate warms, we talked about range of tolerance, right? So when the climate warms in waterways, if the water temperatures go up, or if terrestrial temperatures go up, we now have organisms that can't live within those temperature ranges. And so that means that we could have plants start to die off, or plankton in the water that starts to die off. And those things are our basis for our food chains, which will then cause collapse of ecosystems. So there's many different ways that we will impact biodiversity. If you look at the second square where it talks about those human activities that we do, agriculture and industry and a lot of our economic expansion, we are replacing the ecosystem with something of ours. So whether that's with crops or with pavement or with factories or that kind of thing, we can directly impact what's in those areas. And then we can also, by putting our wastes and those kinds of things, we're changing what the ecosystem was. So we look at that and we say, okay, well, we do these things, but does it really matter? Like, why? So things have always changed over time. What difference does it make? And so we can look at it from two perspectives. We can look at it from the use value, and we can say, well, what do we get from the ecosystem? How does the ecosystem pay us? And we can look at those economic benefits, like getting timber, like having hydroelectric power from the water. We can look at the jobs and income that come from recreation, that kind of thing. But we can also look at the ecological services that we get. Is the area cleaning water for us? Is it storing carbon dioxide for us? Is it creating oxygen for us? What kind of services do we get out of that area? But then there's also that non-use value, which is that just because it's pretty. There's actually been research done that people who can look outside the window and see nature are actually happier because of it. So it has that wellness part for us. And then also just knowing that we want our grandchildren to have the opportunity to go and walk in a forest and see a stream and see animals and things like that. And that's what that bequest for future generations is. So we've got different kinds of ecosystems, and we're going to talk a little bit about like different kinds of ecosystems and how we would support those, and we're going to start with forests. So when we look at, we've talked about some of the ecological services already, but we'll go over a few more of them. But forests help to keep soil in place. So because the water slows down, because the root systems are there, we're keeping the soil in place, things are decomposing in the soil, and so we're increasing the soil fertility in those areas, which helps with the nutrient cycling, helps with water cycling, storing carbon. So we're looking at lots of different services that forests do provide for us. But on the other hand, we also get stuff from the forest, and that's those economic services. We get wood. We use that wood for burning for fuel. We use it for building with lumber. We use it to make paper. A lot of our forests are where mineral-rich deposits are at, so we mine in those areas. We'd run our livestock in there and have them graze in those areas. But this is also places where people like to camp and fish and hike and recreate. And all of these things that are in our economic services provide jobs for areas. Up in the north rim of the Grand Canyon, there's a little town called Fredonia that back in the late 80s and early 80s and leading up to that, it was a timber town. The main job source in the town was the mill. And when the federal government decided to stop timber harvesting in northern Arizona for quite some time, it actually made ghost towns of some of these little places like Fredonia up there, because they just didn't have anything else to support them. We have different kinds of forests, and so they're going to be used for there's different kinds of uses for those forests. We have our old growth forests where we have trees that have been around for thousands of years. This is a picture of the redwoods, which is a really good example of some of our old growth. Many of our old growth forests now are managed for recreational purposes, just because there's so little of it left here in the United States. We also have second growth forests, and that's what this picture is showing us here. A second growth forest has been cut down once and is now regrown. This is most of our land in the United States is considered second growth, but that's also like third growth, fourth growth, and all of that because it's been harvested. And so the picture that you see up here is showing a rotation. So in areas where they know that they don't want to over-harvest and they only want to take from some areas and not the whole area and clear cut everything out. And so they'll only cut for small sections, and then they wait and they come back and they take care of different areas. So they run it like crops on really, really long rotation cycles, which is similar to tree plantations, but second growth forests tend to be like on public lands. Tree plantations tend to be on private lands. We have a lot of tree plantations down in the southern part of the United States and also in the Pacific Northwest. This is where in the Pacific Northwest, this is where a lot of our Christmas trees come from. They plant them like crops. They plant them in rows. They will go and thin out. They will harvest. These are on really short rotations. But this is a crop basically for economic purposes. In the southern part of the United States, things like loblolly pine, things that grow pretty fast, grow pretty straight. They use them for furniture making, for baseball bats, that kind of stuff. When we look at so once again, what does it matter if we actually cut down all the forest? If we think back to all those ecological services that we described a few minutes ago, all those things are gone if we deforest an area, if we take down everything that was in its place. So we have increased erosion. We're not doing the nutrient cycling. We're not storing the atmospheric carbon. We're looking at increased flooding because the vegetation's no longer slowing down all the water that was coming through those areas. And so there's some pretty significant impacts other than just the loss of biodiversity. We're also looking at other impacts that can take years and years and decades in order to recover from. In some cases, there are people who take a stand against that, and that's what this case study was about one lady who decided that she wanted to make a big point that, we shouldn't be cutting down our old growth forests, and so she went and lived in the redwood trees for 2 years to protest the fact that they were cutting down the redwood trees. She probably made some people stop and listen. Unfortunately, the area that she was in still ended up being harvested. But it's that whole idea that these are our shared resources, and we should take a stand if that's something we feel strongly about. When we do harvest the trees, we talk about some of the impacts of deforestation, and one of those is habitat fragmentation. So I want you to imagine that in this block, so they're starting to show this road coming through here, but imagine that the road's not there for a second. And I'm a critter and I live in this forest and I like to roam a lot, so I'm a bear cat or something like that. And I like to use this whole area. Well, if they start coming and putting in a road through here, now that's kind of a barrier that I have to get across, and it starts to fragment my area. When they start to put in those roads, then the next thing they're going to do is they're going to start to harvest the trees, and they're going to use that area for something else. And so in this case, it's agriculture. And so now that barrier that was between me and the rest of my range is now gotten a lot bigger. And here's the thing to think about. It's not just that for some larger animals that move around a lot, they need that bigger space for hunting and for having a place that's safe for them to sleep and to find mates and that sort of thing. And you start to decrease this amount of space that they have, and that becomes a big issue. When it gets even bigger, now I've got very little space left that was my original habitat, right? And I've got this big area that I have to get across. Now, if I'm something that's smaller and I'm something that's an herbivore, some other things that happen is that the farmers then, so I'm in danger because of the highway, because if I try to go across the highway, I might get hit by a truck or a car or something like that. But if I'm an herbivore and the farmers have planted something that I like, now I have a food source that's right there for me, and farmers tend to get a little bit annoyed when the wildlife comes into their farms and eats them. And so now I'm in danger from also getting shot by or trapped or poisoned or something like that by the farmer because I'm coming into this readily made food source that they've already made for me.